Hey everybody, this is chapter 6 of Existential Marxism in Postwar France, from Sartre to Althusser. Chapter 6 is the first chapter of part 3 of the book, titled Toward Existential Marxism, 1957 to 1968. The chapter is titled The Argument Group, Existentialized Marxists. Let's see how to pronounce this according to Google Translate. I always just go with the rule of thumb with when I'm saying a French word to just not say the last consonant unless there's a vowel after it.
Argument. Argument.
Argument. All right. So I was wrong. Argument. So it's called the Argument Group, Existentialized Marxism. Section 1 is titled Argument. Section 2 is titled Marine, Mascolo, and the CP. Section 3 is titled Beyond Philosophy. Section 4 is titled Costas Axelos and the Concept of Play. Section 5 is titled Fugue Rolas, Heideggerian Marxism. Section 6 is titled Chatelet's Concept of Satisfaction. 7 is titled Lefebvre's Concept of Everyday Life. 8 is titled The Question of Freud. So, let's get to it. Alright, so here we go. The Argument Group, Existentialized Marxists. From 1956 to the upheaval of May 1968, Marxism and existentialism were no longer in direct confrontation. Both movements eased their adversary's stance as part of the general change in French intellectual life away from the acrimonious polemicizing of the earlier period. Marxist existentialist Christians and later structuralists, as well as liberals and academics, were talking and listening to one another. Ideological lines are no longer drawn as sharply as during the Cold War period. Lukacs and Goldmann could argue that Jean Piaget's psychology was compatible with Marxism. Teilhardian, Teilhardian, and personalist Christians moved to reconcile themselves with Marxism. Roger Garaudy of the Communist Party was now opening his hands to phenomenologists, existentialists, and even Christians, sincerely initiating dialogue and interchange. The amicable mood of French intellectual life furthered the recognition within Marxism and existentialism that each was incomplete and partial, and that each needed to revise its basic concepts. That sectarian purity did not encourage critical thought. Each camp now began with the accomplishments of the 1940s in an effort to redefine the limits of thought, or better, to reshape the advances of the 1940s into a new type of thought. With this project, the second phase of the encounter between Marxism and existentialism opened. Significant changes in the social formation of France also influenced the tenor and concerns of the debate. The Fourth Republic, although politically as unstable as the Third Republic, did manage to lead France out of the economic stagnation of the 1920s and 1930s. The effect of modern dirigisme, state planning, began with the Monet Plan of the 1940s, was to accentuate concentration and technical modernization in industry and retailing to the extent that many feared, quote, Americanization. The Fifth Republic under de Gaulle continued these domestic trends. To intellectuals, the France of 1960 was qualitatively different from that of 1950. A new France was emerging by 1960 that some called a consumer society, others a post-industrial society, terrain, others a technological society, still others an affluent society. All were agreed that present and future French capitalism would be drastically different from the familiar 19th century image. With this general consensus, intellectuals had to reframe and to give up many precious intellectual certainties that were now obsolete. 1956 represented the watershed in the development of existential Marxism. The intellectuals who witnessed the Hungarian invasion, as well as the revolt in Poland without moving to the right, became the principal forces in developing a Marxism suitable for advanced capitalism. Not only had Sartre made his separation from the Communist Party, but there was a momentary confluence between the major thinkers of Socialisme Barbarie and the group of Marxists now expelled from the Communist Party who went on to establish Argument, Marine, and Axelos. Several informal committees were created at this time: the Committee of Intellectuals Against the War in North Africa and the Saint Just Circle, that served as centers for the exchange of ideas and experiences. Hence, from 1956 onward, there was a continuum of theoretical development that lasted until May 1968 and perhaps beyond. The enduring unity that had begun in 1956 among those who were to develop existential Marxism can be illustrated by the fact of the collaboration of Castoriadis and Lafleur with Morin from Argument in a book on the events of May 1968. So, how did I say it was? Argument.
Argument. Argument.
Argument. In late 1956, a new journal called Argument appeared. Deeply moved by the prospects of de-Stalinization and its early failure in Hungary, the directors of the journal, Edgar Morin, Jean Devignal, Henri Lefebvre, and Pierre Figueroa, were primarily ex-communists. Morin, like Devignal, had joined the Communist Party during World War II and was expelled in 1951. Figueroa, a party theorist, was a professor of philosophy. Lefebvre was a longtime communist and a leader of Marxist theorists in France. Nothing illustrates better the relative amicability of positions at this time than the journal Argument. It was originally conceived by Edgar Morin and Roland Barthes on the model of an interdisciplinary and non-sectarian Italian journal. Footnote. Studies of the Argument group are neither numerous nor conclusive. Soubis's study is very complete, sympathetic yet critical. Bourdet is sharply negative from a quasi-Trotskyist perspective. Gombin, Richard Gombin, he wrote like a bunch of important books. Those were translated in English. So I always take it as a good sign if a book's translated from a single language, one language into another. That's a sign of its quality. And he has several books translated from French to English about the New Left. So Gombin is favorable, viewing Argument as the philosophical basis of the New Left. Argomenti in Italy was established by Franco Fortuny, Franco Mamigliano, and others from Milan and Turin as a center for open Marxist debate and discussion. The Italian editors invited Morin and Roland Barthes to initiate a journal in France on the same model. They made efforts of a similar kind in England and Germany. Argument invited and received articles from all progressive camps. Soubul, a Stalinist historian, Neville, a Trotskyist, Mascolo and Lefebvre, both ex-communists, Colette Audry, a Sartian, Maximilien Rebel, a Marxist humanist, Alain Touraine, a sociologist. Argument was the only Marxist journal in the period of the late 1950s and early 1960s to avoid sectarianism. It therefore became an important center for an exchange of ideas, for an opening up of Marxism toward new intellectual currents and new social phenomena. If Argument was theoretically diverse, its leaders had much in common. They were all shaped by participation in the resistance, joining the Communist Party in the struggle against Nazism. They all left the party mostly in the aftermath of the Hungarian invasion, disillusioned and disoriented but unwilling to retreat from radicalism. After 1956, they were for the most part Paris-based academics and remain so today. In turn, the journal expressed the sudden intellectual liberation of men embittered by the constraints of Communist Party discipline. For the first time, these thinkers could freely explore fundamental questions that for too long had been forbidden. Whole issues were devoted to cultural questions that Marxists normally avoided. And these are titles, I guess, of things. For instance, an article titled The Problem of Love, 1961, and The Problem of Cosmology of 1961. Quite expectedly, there were excesses, romantic posturing about, quote, planetary thought, about thought dans ouverture de l'ouverture, about, quote, post-Marxism, about, quote, unrelenting criticism, end quote. From the cramped dogmatism of Stalinism, Argument, intoxicated with its new freedom, went full swing to the opposite pole. Many independent Marxists like Claude Bourdet, editor of the left wing L'Observateur, who were in sympathy with the group's anti-Stalinism, were repulsed by its often total iconoclasm. And there's a footnote that I missed. L'Observateur, a bi-weekly with a readership of only about 10,000, played an important role for intellectuals as the only organ for non-communist politics. In the early 1960s, it was the center for a germinating new left whose radical views on the Algeria and colonial question had little representation in Parliament. End footnote. At times, Argument read like an abstract negation of Stalinism. Caught in a kind of Oedipal rebellion against a severe father, it defined itself ambiguously as both explicitly Marxist revisionist, implying that it was continuing the Marxist tradition, and as adventurously and brashly beyond Marxism. Nevertheless, the journal dramatically revitalized Marxist thought. Argument defined its thought as one of quote, interrogation, questioning, problematic, end quote. It asked all the repressed questions about Russian socialism, about the role of the superstructure, about the weaknesses of the Marxist theory of knowledge, about the class structure of advanced capitalist society, about the apparent failure of the proletariat to carry out its historical mission. When Argument ceased publication in 1962, its director, Kostas Axelos, claimed that it had accomplished its purpose. An attitude of critical inquiry had been established within Marxism, and although Argument completed no new theoretical, quote, system, a new radical framework was taking shape that would provide a basis for the politics of the new left. What Axelos did not state was that the main thinkers of Argument were at this time dispersed throughout the globe and were no younger men, and there were no younger men on the scene who were considered suitable to take over direction of the periodical. More than the journal, however, it was the collection of books edited and largely written by the Argument group that was to have a very substantial impact on French Marxist theory. Argument translated and published the classic works of Western Marxism, Lukacs' History and Class Consciousness, and Kojeve's Marxism and Philosophy. It brought out the major works of Herbert Marcuse. It published Trotsky, Rudolf Hilferding's Finance Capital, Edward H. Carr's History of Russia, and Karl Wittfogel's Oriental Despotism, all of which challenged fundamental propositions in the conventional wisdom of Stalinism and helped establish a higher level of intellectual debate. Above all, it brought out numerous studies by men of its own group, Axelos, Lefebvre, Châtelet, and Fouguerolas. I don't know how to say that name.
Fouguerolas.
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 Fouguerolas. Still, another important influence for Argument concerned its integration of, quote, bourgeois social sciences with Marxism. In the early 1960s, members of the Argument attended classes given by Paul Lazarsfeld, the quantitative sociologist, and other American social scientists whose mathematical sophistication fascinated them. There is some relationship, I know, between Paul Lazarsfeld and the Frankfurt School. I think it might have been part of the authoritarian personality study or some study that Adorno was involved in. Later on, Pierre Fougerolas
Fougerolas,
Fougerolas, Henri Lefebvre, Joseph Goebbels, and Georges Lapassade went on to make important contributions in political science and sociology. This also aided in bringing a critical perspective to the new generation of students in social science. Before entering into the discussion of the theory of the argument group, I should stress that my use of the term, quote, existentialized Marxist, end quote, is not meant to imply a direct adoption of existentialist doctrine on their part. Rather, I intend this title to refer to their appropriation of notions of subjectivity and of the opening of theory toward action that in a loose sense can be termed existentialist. Section 2. Morin, Mascolo, and the Communist Party. The intellectual biography of Edgar Morin illustrates the background and direction of the argument group. Morin's book Autocritique was an autobiographical recounting of an intellectual's life under Stalinism, his expulsion from the party, and his agonizing reorientation. A style of public self-criticism had developed within the Communist Party as a counterpart to the confessions of the communist leaders at the Moscow trials. With the mass exodus of intellectuals from the Communist Party in the 1950s, the confession became a new genre of the Pilgrim's Progress from Stalinist mystification to intellectual liberation, a coherent if twisted perspective on the world, a total explanation that had been coercively sustained by the party. Stalinism suddenly disintegrated for the intellectual into a pile of sterile, dogmatic sand. Ideas that once were held with passionate intensity now appeared stupid or slightly absurd. Naturally, Morin and the rest foamed with resentment against their Stalinist past, but they did not simply turn into anti-communists. Instead, they sought to learn an intellectual as well as moral lesson from their experience. They struggled to interpret their own past as part of history. A generation younger than Lefebvre, Morin joined the party during the war, filled with a romantic Marxism and, as his self-analysis disclosed, a martyr complex. Along with Hervé and Courtade, he learned a Hegelian Marxism from a disciple of Lukacs, Georg Zszekeres, Zekeres. The communists learned their Hegel not from Kojeve, but from a Hungarian communist. In a loose sense, Morin was always an existential Marxist, never a good Stalinist. He defined his position in the party, along with that of his friends Doince Mascolo and Robert Antelme, as a, quote, existential opposition, end quote. With his romantic impulses, his bits of Hegel, his interest in Sartre, Morin lobbied in the party without success for a recognition of the role of culture. Indeed, the superstructure always interested Morin more than the substructure. No sooner was he out of the party than he published books on the cultural and psychological facets of death and the cinema. Morin's adherence to the party through the 1940s forms a study in cognitive dissonance. With each event, the Reich trials, R-A-J-K, the attack on Tito, etc., Soviet socialism appeared very different from Morin's concept of it, yet he managed to hold in balance the glaring contradiction of reality to his ideas. The party finally took the initiative and excommunicated him when he published an article in the Trotskyist L'Observateur in 1951. By a torturous process of mental reorganization, Morin moved step by step from orthodoxy to existential Marxism. The first Stalinist postulate to vanish was the metaphysical belief in the future. Within official Marxism, it was necessary to believe in Russia as the future realization of communism. All difficulties in the present could be explained by the dogma that Russia embodied the hopes of mankind for emancipation. Once Morin gave this up, he relished existentialism's focus on the present as a healthy tonic. Without faith in the necessity of the kingdom to come, the kingdom of this world could be seen better for what it was. While in the party, Morin saw himself in bad faith, refusing to accept responsibility for his adherence to Stalinism. His personal morality of fighting for authenticity and justice was in total opposition to his ideology. Morally, he rejected the Stalinist system. Ideologically, he rejected his morality. He realized that a Marxist critique of the Soviet Union was urgent, but participation in the party made all criticism impossible. To accept responsibility for his own views, Morin had to leave the party and develop his ideas independently. Eventually, Morin completed the dismantling of his official Marxism. Through reading Socialisme Barbarie, he became critical of the Russian bureaucracy. Then the proletariat lost its monolithic solidarity in his eyes when French workers evidenced no enthusiasm for Polish and Hungarian workers in their demands for worker self-management in 1956. In fact, Morin visited the Polish workers' councils with Lefort and Moskolo. Revolutionary infallibility was no longer an attribute of Russian bureaucrats and French manual laborers. The identification of the empirical working class with the next stage of human realization now collapsed. After several years of personal anguish and difficulty, the ex-communists began to see history from a new light in the manner of the Argument group. The center of his mental world shifted from the fate of Russian politics and the economic struggles of French workers toward the astonishing new features of an advanced capitalist society. A new, quote, planetary era was already in advanced stages of development, an era that witnessed new contradictions very different from those of Marx's model of England in the 19th century. The new contradictions were those of a world of material abundance, security, and comfort, distorted by a, quote, hyper-petty bourgeois, unquote, mentality, what we call the American dream. Material luxury now posed the question, quote, comment vivre, unquote. I don't know what that means. But the, quote, masses did not know how to, quote, enjoy man, unquote. Foreshadowing the concept of play in daily life of the Argument group, Morin announced the, quote, center of the contradiction, unquote. Quote, the petty bourgeois life of comfort becomes a passive life of play with dreams, pastimes, distractions. The great technical adventure requires an active life of play where man, becoming aware of just this adventure, attempts to live, unquote. The existentialist notion of authenticity and Sartre's concept of play as the highest form of human realization were beginning to emerge in the thought of the Argument group. A, quote, total reconversion of our culture is needed, unquote, Morin argued, in order to realize the potentials of the planetary era. The old problems of capitalism remained and new ones were being added. Problems of the psychic life, of culture, modes of alienation that would not magically vanish with the appropriation of the means of production. Hence, the timetable for revolution had to be revised. Quote, the prehistory of man is not near its end, unquote. As Marx said, history progressed on its bad side. Quote, barbarism advances along with civilization, unquote, as the cunning of reason moved in ever more illegible ways. At present, quote, we are in the iron age of the planetary era, unquote, at the beginning of a vastly different, strange, and as yet not fully intelligible world. Still, despair was not the right attitude to take toward the planetary era. A new type of thinking was called for in a new situation, a qualified optimism based on a critical Marxist understanding, but also in Freudian insights and insights from other new disciplines. Was Morin still a Marxist? Quote, yes and no, unquote. Quote, today I think Marxism must be integrated in a more total conception, one that considers man in biological, psychic, and social dialectic, that takes Freud's enormous discovery into account, and that retrieves the problem of the relations between the real and the imaginary, end quote. Morin inaugurated a, quote, integral revisionism, end quote, that presented a, quote, totality that was, quote, open, that accepted, quote, contradictions which were, quote, irreducible, like the contradiction between the real and the imaginary. The urgent need was for a new mode of thought that accepted, quote, unlimited revisionism, critique, relativity, contradiction, end quote, and that struggled continually against reification. The type of thought was the central project of the Argument group, but Morin himself did not systematize it. At the end of the autocritique, Morin mythologized his new insights when he insisted that his intellectual departure was no more than a return to ideas he maintained as a 14-year-old boy, before he was entranced by Stalinism. This Nietzschean eternal return of the same served to unify Morin's life, preserving the integrity of his personality through the barren Stalinist years and in effect rewriting his own history to suit his current preoccupations. A close friend of Morin, Dionce Mascolo, was among the first of the intellectuals to leave the Communist Party after the war. Mascolo played only a minor role in the Argument group, allowing his name to appear on the editorial board and contributing but one article. Yet Mascolo published a book before the appearance of Argument that anticipated many of its themes. His book, Le Communisme Révolution et Communication ou la dialectique des valeurs et des besoins, appeared in 1953, rejected Marx's concept of need because it led to a utilitarian psychology of self-interest. Too often Marx assumed that social groups acted according to their material self-interest, and that the revolution was inevitable, since the obvious self-interest of the workers was to overthrow capitalism. Using the 1844 manuscripts for support, Mascolo gave a non-utilitarian interpretation of Marx's concept of need, relating it to Hegel's notion of desire in the phenomenology. The central thesis of Marx for him was the theory of needs, which represented subjectivity as a, quote, lack, and was the basis of, quote, negativity in social consciousness. Need pressed the individual toward an awareness of the, quote, impossible, toward what did not exist, toward, quote, satisfaction. Need was, quote, the material equivalent of the imagination, quote. As Hegel had shown, desire was born from need, leading inevitably to the emergence of the need for the satisfaction of the desire of desire, or the satisfaction of the potential for human realization, self-realization. What is more, desire led to action, to the conquest of nature and to social relations, to the communication of desire to others. Need and desire were the active side of subjectivity that existentialists, not Karl Marx, had developed. In this anti-Stalinist vision, communism was not simply against exploitation and alienation, it was for human satisfaction. One of the chief faults in Mascolo's thesis was that it did not account for the possibility of false needs or false desires, which was a prominent question in the 1960s. The dialectic of need and desire enabled Mascolo to set a human criterion for social organizations. Men made their own history not only by building social structures, but by seeking to gratify desire. Desire separated social institutions from natural phenomena, discriminating between the blindness of nature and human values. As Lukacs said, the economy, a system of tools, was a, quote, second nature, end quote. The economy was indeed a second nature because it reproduced the unconsciousness of nature itself within the creations of man. The economy could not become human until it was shorn of its naturalness and reflected human desire. History presented a continuous series of distortions of desire in religious myths and ideologies, as men lost the knowledge of the root of desire and need. Hence subjectivity itself took on the qualities of nature and values became commodities that had no direct relation to human need. In this way, Mascolo's concept of desire raised the question of the concept of subjectivity for Marxism that would later be developed by the Argument group. New section, section 3, Beyond Philosophy. In the 1950s and early 1960s, the Argument group published a series of studies that circled loosely around a single problematic, the transcendence of philosophy. Fougerolas, this is his book Les Marxismes en Question of 1959, La Philosophie en Question 1960, and Contradiction et Totalité 1964, Châtelet's La Naissance de l'Histoire 1962, and Logos es Praxis, or Praxis, I don't know, 1962, Axelos's Marx Penseur de la Technique 1961, and Vers la Pensée Planétaire 1964, Lefebvre's Marx Philosophie 1964, and La Métaphilosophie 1965. Most of these works were published in the Argument collection, and all of them centered on the theme, quote, did Marx begin a new type of thought that avoided the difficulties of the Western philosophical tradition, end quote. Quote, did Marx open the path for a critique specifically suited to a dawning age of technology, end quote. In general, the group viewed Marx's position as ambiguous, pointing toward a new kind of knowledge, but also somewhat rooted in the old traditions. Individually, the Argument group came up with diverse, even opposing answers to the question of Marx's transcendence of philosophy. Looking at their works as a whole, we can say that Axelos and Fougerolas tended to be more critical of Marx, while Châtelet and Lefebvre saw less urgency in revising Marx's basic propositions. The Argument group went back beyond the 1844 manuscripts to the earlier doctoral thesis, dealing no longer with the young Marx but with the juvenile Marx. What interested them in the dissertation was Marx's critique of philosophy. They were fascinated by Marx's statement there, quote, that the world's becoming philosophical is at the same time philosophy's becoming worldly, that its realization is at the same time its laws, end quote, Marx. Marx seemed to be calling for the abolition of philosophy as part of the goal of communism, because philosophy was an alienated mode of thought, and presumably Marx himself had invented a new type of thought that would avoid its pitfalls. But how could philosophy be realized? Could the alienation of past philosophy be transcended? Did Marx accomplish these goals? Was Marx's concept of alienation a fulfillment of the new type of thought? Was the project of realizing philosophy identical to the project of the proletariat in abolishing private property? Did Marxism need to be revised in accordance with the notion of transcending philosophy? These were the questions asked by the Argument group. The question of the goal of philosophy was raised by the group with a sharp awareness of the onset of a new historical era. They were now in an age of technology in which the entire globe was qualitatively more unified and alienated than in the past. Material needs were near satisfaction, bringing to light the question of specifically human or poetic needs. Above all, man was no longer viewed in confrontation with nature. To the extent that Marxist thought bore residues of the old Promethean combat with nature, it would have to be shelved. The center of advanced technological society had shifted from work to leisure, from the economic structure to the political and cultural superstructure. The new age raised new problems and new forms of alienation, those of the psyche, of the electronic media, of space-age politics. As a result of these sharply new intellectual concerns, the Argument group rejected old Marxist questions and principles, whether Leninist, Stalinist, or Trotskyist. While undertaking their critique of Marxism, the Argument group found itself inevitably drawn to the existentialists. Axelos and Fougevolas gained their perspective on Marx from studying Heidegger, while Châtelet, and more especially Lefebvre, resorted continually to Sartre's early positions in the book Being and Nothingness, and to his criticism of dialectical materialism, in the article Materialism and Revolution. The differences between Heidegger and Sartre, while in some respects great, were not enough to break the unity of the Argument group's Existential Marxism. These general comments about the Argument group will become more concrete through a review of their positions on the question of the transcendence of philosophy. New section, section 4, Kostas Axelos, and the concept of play. Kostas Axelos, who took on the burden of editing Argument and later directed the collection, came to France from Greece during the Civil War on the same boat with Castoriadis and Costa Papaioannou, a right-wing Marxist. I don't know what that means in this context. We have already discussed Axelos' critique of Marx as a prophet of technique in Marx, Penseur de la Technique. In that book, as well as in articles published in the late 1950s and early 1960s, collected as Vers la pensée planétaire, Axelos discerned a deep flaw in Marx's thought, that Marx remained in the metaphysical tradition of philosophy since Plato, an argument that Axelos took over from Heidegger. The existentialist interest in Marx dated from the first edition of the 1844 Manuscripts. Landshut, its editor, was a student of Heidegger, and Heidegger assisted him in that venture. Later, in his, quote, letter on humanism, it answered to questions from the French Heideggerian Jean Bouffret. Heidegger argued that humanism, whether Sartre's or Marx's, was, first, inadequate to confront the crisis of man in, quote, an age of technology, end quote, and, quote, mass culture, end quote, and second, inadequate to reveal the profundity of human reality. His call for a new philosophical criticism suited to a technological age pleased the Marxists of the Argument group, but the other argument against Marx had greater impact on them. For Heidegger, humanism led to metaphysics, since it purported to dislocate an essence of man, like Marx's species being or Descartes' cogito, the idea of an essence-made man, into just another animal species, whereas for Heidegger, human reality was existence, a, quote, standing in the clearing of being, end quote. Because man stands outside himself, he is open to being, not just to human being. In the 20th century, man has lost his awareness of being. This is the substance of his crisis. Humanism failed to transcend human reality toward being, and hence reduced the scope of human possibility. Impressed by this argument, Axelos wrote a book on the relation of Marx and Heidegger, Einführung in ein künftiges Denken, über Marx und Heidegger, an article on Heidegger et le problème de la philosophie, published Bouffret's Dialogue avec Heidegger in the Argument series, as well as a translation, quote, "The Principe de la Pensée," and participated in a colloquium on Heidegger with Bouffray, Lefebvre, and Châtelet that was printed in Argument. Axelos's search for an open, fragmentary, multi-dimensional, poetic, planetary thought led him to Pascal and Nietzsche. Their aphoristic style were examples of thought that did not close itself into a system. Axelos also discovered fragmentary thought in Rimbaud, as in Arthur Rimbaud. Rimbaud had announced the demise of humanist metaphysics, quote, "L'homme a fini," end quote. The end of man meant the end of the metaphysics of reason, of man who divided the world into reason and unreason, cutting himself off from being. La pensée planétaire was a kind of thinking that resembled the dialectic, but the dialectic shorn of metaphysics. Floundering in humanism since Plato, Western philosophy collapsed being into thought. The search for a truly dialectical mode of thought led Axelos, following Heidegger and Nietzsche, to the pre-Socratics, especially to Heraclitus. Unlike Plato, the pre-Socratics thought within the totality. The pre-Socratic concept of physis was a genuine totality that Heraclitus set in motion with his concept of becoming. Since the totality was always in flux, it could never be fixed in an intellectual system. It was always open to new creations. This vision of the world was an open totality suited to Axelos's intuition that creativity needed safeguarding in a technocratic society. For Axelos, Marx's concept of alienation was not adequate to the need for an open totality, since it failed to allow sufficient autonomy to political and even philosophical alienation. For this reason, Marx did not invent a theory of knowledge that was truly revolutionary. Marx's concept of alienation also concealed the alienation inherent in the development of technology, whether capitalist or socialist. For Marx had reduced human reality to work, to making tools to conquer nature, to produce efficient machines that led to automation, which he did not call enough attention to. What he did not call enough attention to was that human reality also had to create itself. In Rimbaud's words, quote, "to change life," end quote, not only to satisfy material needs, but to attain the full satisfaction of desire. Because of his faulty conception of alienation, a metaphysical anthropology of homo faber entered into Marx's thought. Subjectivity was reduced to tool-making. And it had no right of satisfaction of its own. Marx therefore was unable sufficiently to integrate materialism and spiritualism. In a brilliant revision of the Theses on Feuerbach, Axelos summarized his position. Here is his first thesis on Marx, quote, "The principal fault of all historico-dialectical materialism, including Marx's, is that the object, reality, the materials are taken only under the form of produced objects, material realities, materials of work. They are thus effectively grasped, but they lack a ground and a horizon. This is why the other side was developed in a metaphysical way, in opposition to naive or sophisticated realism, by idealist philosophy, which naturally neither knew nor recognized the world we call real. The totality of forms, forces, and weaknesses of the constituted, concretized, and fixed world, the mode of being of the constituting and open world, the other side of the same and unique world. Marx wanted sensible objects to be superior to ideal objects, but he did not grasp human activity itself as problematic activity. Thus he considered in the contribution of the critique to the critique of political economy, as much as in the poverty of philosophy, material life is the only truly human one, while thought and poetry were grasped only in their conditional and ideological forms. End quote. Axelos. Axelos was rejecting not the basic elements of Marx's thought, only its emphasis and its consequent lacunae. The result of capturing human thought and action in the moment of work was that Marx reintroduced metaphysics and dualism. Quote, "The thought of Marx is metaphysical as soon as it wants to transcend oppositions and dualism. It is metaphysical, as is all Western and European thought since Descartes, in that it privileges the physical and sensible in relation to the, quote, metaphysical," end quote, end quote. Axelos. Marx was still thinking in terms of the antagonism of man and nature. Now in the 20th century, with the conquest of nature practically over, it was possible, Axelos argued, to see what had been concealed from Marx by virtue of Marx's Lebenswelt. Not sure. I think it's Life World. Not sure. Planetary thought could now place man's poetic self-creation on the same plane with his relation to nature, avoiding metaphysics. We must note that Sartre, in the book Being and Nothingness, to a very large degree, had set forth the same proposition, except for his Cartesian residues. The conclusion that Axelos drew from his critique of Marx were exactly those of Sartre. Avoiding the metaphysics of idealism and materialism, planetary thought discovered the most appropriate dimension of thought and action in play. The planetary thought of Axelos led to the same conclusion as Sartre had reached, both in later work called Les Jeux des Mondes and Vers la Pensée Planétaire. Unlike Sartre, Axelos did not develop clear ideas about how human reality opened to being in play. Rather, he took off in poetic excursions. Quote, nothing ever elucidates completely. Prelude, developments and especially ending remain problematic. We are always embarked en route. We are ... in the interlude. What we are and what we are not is the interlude, not only between two games, but in the game. In the game. Man is taken in the game of the world, enjoying it on many levels, himself and the game. End quote. Axelos. Axelos' thought ended in fragmentary visions of the possibility of a world of play, a poetic and prophetic call to begin the game of authentic life. One might ask how we can be liberated from a metaphysics of work while we are confronted not by hostile nature, but by bureaucratic socialism and monopolistic capitalism. The one clear meaning play did have for Axelos was its connection with the dialectic. Play was the living openness of the dialectic, not the finitude of death. Certainly Axelos' image of play had nothing to do with Rand Corporation war games, with families engaged in monopoly, which I think is referring to the game Monopoly, with a Freudian concept of play of acting out. Ironically, Axelos' existential Marxism relied on the somber broodings of Heidegger, with his preoccupation with death and care, Sorge, S-O-R-G-E, with the inauthenticity of everyday life in the technical world, where people lost themselves in things and were blind to the terribly serious business of the quest for being, only to emerge of the philosophy of play. In French fashion, like Fourier and Sartre, Axelos' vision of the game of the world did have a lightness of tone far removed from the spirit of his Teutonic. I don't know how to say that word. Teutonic as in reference to German. Is it Teutonic or Teutonic? Teutonic or Teutonic? Let me see. I've been reading in my car, and I haven't been had access to the internet while I was doing that. But now I do, so I can look things up. English.
Teutonic.
It is Teutonic. Okay. In French fashion, like Fourier and Sartre, Axelos' vision of the game of the world did have a lightness of tone far removed from the spirit of his Teutonic teacher. New section. Fouché-Rolas' Heideggerian Marxism. The same age as Edgar Morin, Pierre Fouché-Rolas had joined the party at the same time, in 1942, but he stayed in it until the Hungarian invasion. With his training in philosophy, Fouché-Rolas confronted Marxism with the new technological world in the book Le Marxisme en Question of 1959. Here, Fouché-Rolas diverged from existing Marxism far more than any other major figure in the argument group. The basic agreement with Sartre, Fouché-Rolas announced that in basic agreement with Marx, Fouché-Rolas denounced that true Marxism, announced that true Marxism was not represented by Stalin's diamat, but by the historical concept of the alienation and liberation of man. The trouble is that even this true Marxism contained, quote, metaphysical residues, end quote, that Fouché-Rolas thought urgently required revision. In the spirit of the argument group, he argued that the, quote, age of systems was over, unquote, and that a drastically new type of thought was needed, one that was not dogmatic but, quote, problematic, one that raised questions. Borrowing from Kojeve, he disputed Marx's attempt to reduce all forms of alienation to economic alienation. The elements of the superstructure were in part relative to the economic base, but they were also other, quote, other than this base and required distinct theories of explanation. Fouché-Rolas's book on politics, La conscience politique dans la France contemporaine, demonstrated empirically that political consciousness was in large measure independent from, quote, socioeconomic interests, end quote. Political consciousness was an effort to construct an integrated total worldview, manifesting man's capacity to create, quote, norms beyond any reduction to the economic base. Fouché-Rolas, as for Sartre, Marxism did not account for the capacity of consciousness to transcend the given. In addition to reducing all forms of alienation to the economy, Marxist thought contained elements of metaphysical optimism and eschatological myth. His vision of the, quote, total end of alienation was, for Fouché-Rolas, a mystifying hope that was not justified by historical reality and did not further whatever liberation from alienation was possible. Quote, to suppose that man, once he achieved economic and social liberation, would become ipso facto the total man announced by Marx is surely an imprudent affirmation, end quote. Fouché-Rolas. Fouché-Rolas wanted a more modest Marxism that would allow for an indefinite process of overcoming alienation, as well as the acceptance of theories, like Freud's, that accounted for specific types of alienation in the superstructure. Fouché-Rolas's critique of Marx's concept of alienation was in part influenced by his pessimistic mood. He lost faith in the working class, Russian socialism, and the French Communist Party. His call for the acceptance of theories that accounted for the autonomous alienations in the superstructure, as well as for the recognition of the active role of consciousness in history, were typical of existential Marxism, but his insistence that alienation was without end was not clarified. He never indicated specifically why men had to lose the power over their own experience, or in what respects or conditions this was so. To argue for this, one has to resort to some metaphysical principle in order to sustain the idea of the incapacity of men to control their lives. In Fouché-Rolas's case, his belief in eternal alienation was based on an impression from his own experience of the direction of history. Marx's faith in the full eradication of alienation under communism was dissonant with his mood in the early 1960s. In his book on the mass media, L'action sur l'homme, Cinéma et Télévision, 1961, Fouché-Rolas reached what was, from a Marxist viewpoint, the worst possible diagnosis that the primary mutilation of men occurred no longer at work but in leisure activities. With history gone so far amok, the basic principles of Marxism were more of a hindrance than a help. Fouché-Rolas accepted many of the conclusions of liberal end-of-ideology social scientists. Not only was the working class apparently uninterested in a Marxist revolution, but Fouché-Rolas was persuaded by Jean Fourastier, maybe? Fourastie with an accent. I think when you have the accent, you pronounce the vowel that it's over. So Jean Fourastier and others that advanced technology eliminated the working class and created, quote, new middle class, end quote, rather than a new working class of technicians, engineers, and clerical workers. In other studies, La philosophie en question of 1960 and Contradiction et totalité, ce gisement et déploiement de la dialectique of 1964, Fouché-Rolas attended to the questions of the argument group. La philosophie en question studied the meaning of the realization of philosophy, while Contradiction et totalité took a close look at the nature of dialectical thought. The earlier work presented the argument group's typical blend of Heidegger and Marx. Man was faced with a crisis due to the technification of his existence that traditional philosophy could not clarify. Nevertheless, the only resort men have, faced with their current dilemma, is the invention of a new philosophy. Quote, without doubt, the anguish of contemporary man resides in the technification of his existence, and the anguish of philosophical consciousness comes from facing the enigma of being without properly identifying it. It seems to us, however, that philosophical activity is the highest recourse of this man, menaced by dehumanization, and that the anguished existence of this same man is the supreme recourse of a philosophy that has decided to extract itself from thematic multiplicities in order to rediscover its original unified problematic. End quote. Fouché-Rolas. Existentialism needed a neo-Marxist critique of technological society, and neo-Marxism needed an existentialist comprehension of anguished consciousness. Contradiction et totalité was part of a new concern with the nature and meaning of the dialectic which arose in the early 1960s, when it was recognized that neither Heidegger nor Marx had adequately resolved its problems. Sartre pioneered this effort with Critique de la raison technique dialectique. The sociologist Georges Gervich, in the book Dialectique et Sociologie of 1962, sought to apply his, quote, hyper-empiricism, end quote, to a theory of the dialectic that would avoid the alleged dogmatisms of Marx in his, quote, descending materialist dialectic of the, quote, end of the, quote, ascending dialectic of idealism. Quote, Marx's dialectic, despite all its realism and all its empiricism, remains ascending and apologetic. It is the triumphant march toward a humanity reconciled with itself in a realized dream of terrestrial paradise. And it is the apology for the suppression of all servitude, of all constraint, all obstacles. It is the apology for the end of history. ... End quote. Recognizing these dangers in the dialectic, Fouché-Rolas attempted to modify it to suit the requirements of, quote, fragmentary thought, end quote. Fouché-Rolas' articulation of the dialectic was representative of the argument group's orientation. Rejecting dialectical materialism, he was concerned to show that the dialectic was quintessentially a critical weapon, the antithesis of dogmatism. Against Sartre, he proclaimed that the dialectic was not a type of reason and not a method. He proceeded to reformulate the dialectic somewhat arbitrarily and abstractly, as he admitted, as consisting of two poles, one of contradiction, the other of totality. In essence, the dialectic was a totality and contradiction. Contradictions were of two types: alterity, the more otherness of things juxtaposed as in nature, and alienation, the lost otherness of human contradictions. For its part, totality was divided into globality, the extent of the totality, and integration, the unity of the totality. Furthermore, there were no inherent contradictions and no closed totalities. Contradictions in themselves and totalities in themselves were only concepts. Real contradictions and real totalities were always partial, always to be transcended, leaving the dialectic in a permanent state of openness. Thus Fouché-Rolas laid the groundwork for a dialectic that would allow continuous criticism and continuous development in a society. A, quote, problematic, quote, open, quote, planetary thought was now constituted. For a connection with Marxism, Fouché-Rolas termed his thought a true dialectical anthropology, while as a philosophy it was a, quote, transcendental phenomenology, end quote. Both Marxists and existentialists, it would guarantee the unlimited freedom and negativity of consciousness. Fouché-Rolas was bent on, quote, deontologizing the dialectic to assure the avoidance of a new dogmatism. However, an attack on dogmatism easily becomes itself a dogmatism, and Fouché-Rolas' failure to deduce adequately his basic categories left him open to this charge. Still, a beginning had been made on what is one of the thorniest problems of existential Marxism. New section, section 6. Chatelet's concept of satisfaction. Unlike Axelos, Chatelet's existential Marxism relied less on Heidegger than on Sartre. Even so, Chatelet's debt to Sartre was primarily on the negative side of agreement with the existentialist critique of Stalinist philosophy. In addition, Chatelet was much more prepared to modify Marx than were Axelos and Fouché-Rolas. By the mid-1960s, he defected somewhat from existential Marxism to the structuralist Marxism of Althusser, the only about-face of its kind among the existential Marxists. In the book Logo et Praxis, Chatelet complained that the important question of the suppression and realization of philosophy raised by Marx had been neglected by Marxists. The purpose of his own work would be to, quote, define how Marx, in opposing traditional philosophy, conceived theoretical work, end quote. From the outset, Chatelet, in existential Marxist fashion, attacked Marx for forgetting the, quote, active side of consciousness, end quote. the truth that it was necessary, quote, to do philosophy, end quote. In the end, he, like Sartre, discovered liberating praxis in the heart of consciousness with the concept of satisfaction. Again, like Sartre, Châtelet found the activity of consciousness as the source of the uniqueness of man, his difference from the technological world of things, manifesting a concern for a type of alienation that was fundamentally technological. To uncover the meaning of Marx's pronouncement about the, quote, worlds becoming philosophical, end quote, and, quote, philosophies becoming worldly, end quote, Châtelet studied the origins of philosophy in Greece. La naissance de l'histoire, 1962. He investigated, in the book La naissance de l'histoire, 1962, Châtelet investigated the relation between the beginning of philosophy and the cultural decision to, quote, make history, end quote. Châtelet found the two interconnected. Châtelet found, in short, philosophical consciousness is basic to a new self-conscious stage of human becoming. The book, quote, wants to show that the ultimate basis on which the comprehension, of historicity and the cultural decision to make history can develop is the seizure by man of the political dimension of his fate. The consciousness that he is of being an active subject in this sensible, profane world, in the heart of a community on which he depends, that is the knowledge of real freedom. End quote. Châtelet. A good Hegelian, Châtelet here connected the origin of freedom with the act of doing philosophy. Against the vulgar Marxists, Châtelet located this all-important historical act as a political act, not an economic one. The meaning of the origin of philosophy, and hence the meaning of the end of philosophy, was articulated in logos et praxis. Philosophy began in the attempt to solve a problem in the Greek community. Logos was related to praxis. Before philosophy, the Greeks believed that ideas were governing principles of action, a kind of practical wisdom. In the class structure of Greece, conflicts developed between different groups in civil society who were acting on their different ideas. Contradictions of ideas were hence related to class conflicts. Philosophy was born in the attempt to resolve the problem of conflict in the polis, the universal political realm beyond civil society, by seeking to resolve the contradictions in the ideas held by different groups. Philosophy originated with the concept of logos that was beyond the world of ideas, and this logos was implicated in the political question of preserving the polis by ending class warfare. The philosopher and the citizen, those concerned with general warfare beyond the welfare, beyond the particular interest of his group, were born in the same historical act. Such was the richness of philosophy in its origins. The particular way in which it sought to solve the question, however, was the source of its poverty overcome only by Hegel and by Marx. Philosophy sought to prove the generality and universality of logos over against the particularity of ideas in order to provide a basis for reconciliation. Aiming at the universal truth of logos, this new form of thought was compelled to rise above the practico-sensible world of the polis. Since logos could not really resolve the class conflicts, there was no universal class like the proletariat in carrying out its program. It entered the, quote, ivory tower, end quote, of pure theory. More and more, philosophy resorted to the ideal realm of the locus of justice, digressing from its original connection to praxis. Châtelet went on to show that the philosopher's logos did develop an answer to social conflict with the concept of satisfaction. Philosophy recovered the source of conflict in the polis as the lack of the true satisfaction of each human being in the community. For example, Plato's concept of justice in the Republic. The philosophical breakthrough did not come until Hegel placed the concept of satisfaction at the end of his phenomenology, where the dialectic of human becoming had at last resolved the contradictions between the ideal and the real. The Greeks too had discovered the concept of satisfaction as the true fulfillment of man's potentials, yet they limited it to fulfillment in reason alone. If men actualized their potentials for rationality and identified with the universal, the polis would be saved. After Hegel had put the concept of human realization in motion, Marx found the true answer to the riddle of philosophy. Marx eliminated the question left hanging by the Greeks, the contradiction between logos and praxis, by indicating how philosophy could be surpassed only in its realization. He made his astounding discovery by demonstrating that, quote, The necessity of the transcendence of philosophy is based, on the recognition of the historical and human importance of the philosophical decision, that the failure of philosophy has as its profound cause a fact, the historical situation of man through a long epoch that permits him to conceive of freedom, but not of realizing it, to perceive the role of universal thought, but not make it practical, to propose solutions to the problems of natural and social alienation, but not to work to make these solutions effective, that the situation of philosophy today has evolved just because of the success of industrial society. Thus, the negation of philosophy is the realization of its deepest objective, to make exist empirically the universal life, end quote. Châtelet. Marx brought philosophy from heaven to earth. He alchemized idealism into materialism by reintroducing the connection of logos with praxis, by reformulating logos into a doctrine of the historical becoming of the real, and by discovering the hidden structures of praxis in industrial capitalism. Put most directly, Marx uncovered the possibilities of the empirical material basis of universal human satisfaction in the alienation of industrial society. Marx brought philosophy back to human action. Marx seduced logos back into the quote street of history, unquote. That's a cool phrase, isn't it? One second, sorry. Shit. For Châtelet, Marx transcended philosophy only through the aid of Hegel. By placing Hegel, and for that matter Marx, in the tradition of Greek philosophy, Châtelet, like Axelos and Fujivolas, skirted, for better or worse, the Judeo-Christian elements in their thought. The existential Marxists acknowledged Marx's debt to Hegel for the latter's historical anthropology, his dialectic, his concept of human realization as satisfaction. Still, Marx broke significantly with Hegel by, quote, grasping man in his empirical reality, end quote. Châtelet viewed Marx's achievements in overcoming philosophy in absolute terms, by making human satisfaction dependent upon the conquest of nature. Marx had solved once and for all the riddle of history. The specific tasks of Marxism in suppressing and realizing philosophy were concrete and limited. It did not need to create a new ontology, a new theory of knowledge, or become, quote, an encyclopedia of the sciences, end quote. Its aim was limited to, quote, showing that humanity could not realize its fundamental goal, that of universal empirical satisfaction, implying the growth of the power of man over nature, the multiplication of human needs, the possibility of satisfying them, and the definitive abolition of historical violence, except by recognizing in its fundamental being, as active materiality, struggling against a material world whose intelligibility is henceforth furnished by the experiential sciences, end quote. By ending class warfare, the proletariat would resolve the question raised in Greece of overcoming violence in the polis. Although Châtelet clarified the meaning of the realization of philosophy, he relied far too heavily on the empirical fact that history was progressing toward final satisfaction, that the proletariat indeed embodied the mission of humanity. Furthermore, Châtelet did not confront Marx's reliance on an abstract anthropology, Feuerbach's species being. If philosophy was transcended in concrete satisfaction, the nature of the being who was satisfied was left somewhat up in the air. Châtelet was also less satisfactory than Axelos in rethinking the new type of thought that was introduced by Marx. Châtelet did, however, stress the existential side of Marxism, its concern with active consciousness, with the role of subjectivity in the becoming of man. At the conclusion of Logos et Praxis, he acknowledged the existentialist concept of death. Marx's dialectic of need and work were, quote, insufficient, end quote, to explain human history. Bowing to Kierkegaard and Heidegger, he noted that, quote, in truth, the consideration of the empirical requires that this tragic dimension of human existence be recognized, end quote. Death constitutes, quote, an irreducible existential dimension, end quote, a kind of, quote, alienation, end quote, but one qualitatively different from the alienation of nature and society. Still, Châtelet evasively refused to place human finitude as, quote, the determining element in the present human problematic, end quote. But Châtelet never specified just how the alienation of finitude was different from those of nature and society. Without explaining why death was not determinate in history, Châtelet proclaimed his active faith in the revolution, quote, it is not a matter of pretending that individual problems, or the existential problem of the individual, his imperfection, his anguish, and his finitude, are without importance, or will be resolved by the construction of a really coherent human world. On the contrary, what Marxism affirms, it seems, is that these problems cannot be resolved. It would be naive to wish to predict it in any way, except in a universe where the individual finally finds himself free in the wealth of his particular determinations. What is important is knowing the present problematic of humanity and lucidly participating in the struggle for the creation of a society that permits the indefinite development of human potentials and that makes man exist as man, that realizes effective freedom. End quote. Châtelet. Châtelet's existential Marxism prophesied communism as a society of free, authentic individuals in Sartre's sense. His existential Marxism was incomplete. However, to the extent that he could not define these structures of consciousness and action which made the revolution probable, beyond the simple acceptance of Marx's concepts by the masses in an act of rational self-consciousness.
New section, section 7. Lefebvre's concept of everyday life. Heading A, the break with the Communist Party. Lefebvre was among the first Communist Party intellectuals to confess his sins in an autocritique. In 1949, he apologized for making Marxism into a theory of knowledge, for relying too heavily on Hegel and the young Marx, and for thinking too much like a philosopher. Just those intellectual traits which are to make him the leader of rejuvenated Marxism. A glance at his long publication list reveals that Lefebvre retreated to the relatively uncontroversial sphere of literary criticism, a tactic also used by Lukacs in a time of political orthodoxy. From the years of his autocritique until his break with the Communist Party in 1956, he published works on Pascal, Diderot, Musset, Rabelais, and a piece titled Contribution à l'esthétique. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Before the onset of Zhdanovist restraints, Lefebvre did his best to expand and spread a view of Marxism grounded in the concept of alienation. Back in 1934 with Norbert Gutterman, he introduced selections from the 1844 manuscripts in a text that held its freshness enough to be reprinted in the 1960s. Lefebvre wrote 3 introductions to Marxist thought, advocating a Marxist humanism, and he wrote 2 theoretical works on aspects of Marxist thought left in obscurity under Stalin, Alienation, and the Dialectic. With so much to be done by way of rethinking Marxism, the yoke endured from the late 1940s until 1957 must have weighed heavily on Lefebvre. His discontents with official Marxism were expressed immediately upon his expulsion from the party in an article in the Thème Moderne in 1957, Le Marxisme et la Pensée Française, and 2 books, Problème actuel du Marxisme in 1958, and an autocritique which won the Prix de Critique, La Somme et la Reste, in 1959. In these works, Lefebvre rehearsed the sad humiliations of an intellectual under Stalinism. Like Marin, he was brought before the Central Committee and interrogated about his, quote, lack of discipline, meaning that he published articles without the express approval of the party. In this interview, there was no intellectual debate about Marxism and no explicit criticism of the ideas. This is in the spring of 1956, before the Hungarian invasion. 28 years of party membership were terminated with punishment deserved by a naughty child. Once expelled from the confines of Stalinism, Lefebvre immediately rediscovered his pre-party interest in existentialism, the same existentialism he had so crudely derided in 1946. Searching to gain his theoretical equilibrium before embarking on new directions, he again reviewed the corpus of Marxism, only to expound a heretical existential Marxism. His studies of 1957 to 1959 labored to untangle official Marxism and redirect critical thought toward a philosophy of freedom. Quote, human consciousness owes to Marxism a new ideal, that of concrete freedom, end quote. Lefebvre sensed a new world situation. Quote, we must now take up the work and construct an open palace with all sides to the light, to the air, to the people, end quote. The new question he posed became the program of the Argument group and of existential Marxism, the nature of Marxist philosophy, the relation of theory and practice, the questions of objectivity and of the state, those of the superstructure and of consciousness. New heading B, Marxism and Philosophy. Outside the party, Lefebvre, who was trained in philosophy, could look at the question of philosophy in earnest. He presented Marx's text on philosophy along with his interpretation of them in a little book in the Philosophe series in 1964. A year later, he published his Métaphilosophie in the Argument collection. Overall, Lefebvre wavered considerably between viewing Marxism as a new kind of philosophy and as a type of sociology. All in all, Lefebvre devoted more attention to a Marxist sociology. In the book Métaphilosophie, the familiar pattern of the Argument group was restated. Marx's highest achievement was in calling for and partially achieving the transcendence of philosophy. Traditional philosophy was lost in a distinct form of alienation that derived from the separation of thought and action. Lefebvre stressed especially the prerequisite of the withering away of the state for the realization of philosophy. Lefebvre's anti-statism was pointed at Stalinist Russia, but it was also a mark of the importance given to the superstructure by existential Marxism. Having rejected philosophy, Lefebvre scanned the European intellectual tradition for signs of a new direction. Conscious of the inadequacies of Marx, he looked primarily to the existentialists, to Nietzsche, Heidegger, and especially Sartre. Like Marx, they had begun the quest for dialectical reason, except they had developed a concept of the active side of consciousness in the process of human becoming. Here Lefebvre relied heavily on the studies of Axelos and Châtelet, including, like them, the pre-Socratic Heraclitus in his list of Héritiers. For Lefebvre, the new mode of thought, metaphilosophy, would have several original characteristics. It would be anti-systematic. It would be neither ontological nor anthropological. It would conceive itself as part of the project of, quote, transforming the world, end quote, thereby regenerating the Sartrean, quote, reflection on freedom, end quote. Metaphilosophy would begin with Marx's greatest accomplishment, the concept of alienation, which is more relevant than ever since men were suffering from a second-degree alienation, being alienated from their alienation and living, quote, happily, yet without realizing their freedom. By the 1960s, Lefebvre could no longer accept Marx's concept of alienation as a finished product. In its Marxist form, it was too, quote, weak to account for such disturbing new phenomena as the revival of astrology and the, quote, religion of the cosmonauts, end quote. The reality of human alienation was much more complex than Marx had understood, since each region of social life contained entire networks of alienation in their own right. An elaboration of the specific forms of alienation would be a primary task of metaphilosophy. Concrete studies of contemporary forms of alienation would eliminate the residue of, quote, ontologism in Marx's articulations. And its other fault was apparent in recent studies, like Rubel's, where alienation was ethical, an error Lefebvre himself had made in his earlier concept of the, quote, total man. At bottom, each of these misconceptions blunted the revolutionary force of the concept since they cut it off from praxis. The primary thrust of metaphilosophy for Lefebvre was to renew the vital link between theory and practice. This revision, however, called for modification of Marx's concept of praxis, since it accounted only for instrumental interactions like the following: labor activity, political functions, interactions of social classes, analytical and logical rationality, technology, and bureaucracy. The concept of praxis left out a great deal of human experience. What Lefebvre added was an existentialist concept that he called poesis, the experience and creation of human nature. The concept of poesis included the creation of the city, the idea of, quote, absolute love, psychoanalysis, the decision to change one's life, in short, the creation of new, quote, situations. Lefebvre then added a concept of, quote, mimesis to account for routine aspects of daily life. Finally, to avoid certain tendencies in Hegelian Marxism toward historicism, he recognized certain, quote, residues, stressing the fact that, quote, each activity that differentiates itself tends to constitute itself into a system, a, quote, world, end quote, Lefebvre, containing something, quote, precious and, quote, essential that has been and might continue to be preserved. In sum, metaphilosophy revealed historical action as consisting of praxis, poesis, mimesis, and residues. A general fault in Lefebvre's thinking was his proliferation of categories without clarifying them, as for example in his revision of the concept of praxis. The book Metaphilosophy resisted this tendency by unifying the new ideas under the concept of daily life. In the last analysis, the relation of theory and practice confronted the, quote, fundamental contradiction, end quote, between philosophy and the non-philosophical daily life. The alienation of philosophy was measurable by the degree to which it gave privilege to certain aspects of reality and devalued others. Philosophy's goal of universality, taken over by Marx, was arrested by the non-intelligibility of daily life. Quote, it belongs to metaphilosophy through metaphilosophical thought to imagine and to propose forms, or rather a style that can practically construct and realize the philosophical project by transforming daily life. The project of a radical transformation of daily life cannot be separated from the transcendence of philosophy and its realization, end quote. Lefebvre. New section, section C, Daily Life in the Modern World, or new heading, Daily Life in the Modern World. The first mention of the concept of daily life appeared as far back as 1936 with the publication of La Conscience Mystifiée. The volume was to be the first in a series called Cinq Essais de Philosophie Materialiste, of which the third would have the title Critique de la vie quotidienne. Lefebvre published such a volume subtitled Introduction in 1947, followed by a second volume subtitled Fondements d'une sociologie de la quotidienneté in 1961, and finally a précis of a projected third volume, La vie quotidienne dans le monde moderne, in 1968. With perseverance, he elaborated the concept of daily life throughout his career. In 1933 to 1934, the concept of daily life was simply a negative notion of oppressed, ordinary existence. At this time, however, Lefebvre was already demanding that Marxists take into account the need for a cultural revolution that would recover in its original force the theoretical elan toward the universal and achieve it practically in a universal human community, end quote, Lefebvre. This is the same notion that was called in the 1960s the realization of philosophy. Lefebvre already had the germ of an existential Marxism, stressing the need for a, quote, method of precise comprehension of the possible, end quote, in which, quote, romanticism was, quote, useful. Even in the 1930s, Marxism for him was a form of humanism that did not, quote, fix human reality into a, quote, eternally present, end quote, essence. The chief concern of Marxism was not with the economic structure, but with, quote, revolutionary consciousness, end quote. La Conscience Mystifiée, written amidst the struggle against fascism, did not take the concepts of the young Marx very far, but simply restated them in relation to present events. Critique de la vie quotidienne, Introduction, was more a document in the rediscovery of Marx's concept of alienation than a departure from Marx toward a new concept of daily life. It tasted of the resistance spirit of national renovation, based on a traditional image of French politics and society. In the Introduction, Marx's philosophy of alienation was seen as already presenting a fully developed concept of daily life. Lefebvre coined the concept only to remind Marxists that the revolution required a transformation of consciousness that depended on the material base of daily life. The concept of daily life was to be distinguished from the regions of experience which invoked by romantics and surrealists in art and existentialists in philosophy. The significance of daily life was that it alone was a measure of the progress of the dialectic of alienation and human becoming. Lefebvre announced that man would be fully human only when daily life became a festival. For an example of daily life as a festival, he romantically invoked ancient Greece during its holidays, when repressive norms were forgotten and, quote, tau es permis. Under capitalism, daily life was characterized by alienation, fetishism, and the lack of human satisfaction. This was still a very abstract analysis that did not concretely touch the core structures of the quotidian. New heading, heading 2, or I guess this is a subheading, the concept of modernity. In the second and third volume of his study of daily life, Lefebvre situated daily life in a fresh social theory of modernity. History had not gone according to Karl Marx's timetable. Socialist revolutions had occurred in underdeveloped societies, serving only as a vehicle of modernization. One second. Excuse me. History had not gone according to Karl Marx's timetable. Socialist revolutions had occurred in underdeveloped societies, serving only as a vehicle of modernization. In the West, consequently, quote, the whole structure defined by Marx 100 years ago is collapsing for want of a revolution that would have sustained and furthered the, quote, human totality, end quote, end quote. Lefebvre. Some trends noticed by Marx were continuing: the socialization of society, the integration of the planet, the concentration of wealth. On the other hand, monopoly capitalism had replaced competitive capitalism. Superstructure and base interpenetrated each other and lost their distinct outlines. Old social classes had been transformed. New ideological structures and modes of alienation had arisen. Technological alienation was common to capitalist and socialist countries alike. The old proletariat, no longer immediately revolutionary in any sense, was being progressively depoliticized. Its economic demands had lost their political character, threatened by automation. Workers sought stability of employment first. Their needs resembled more and more those of the petty bourgeoisie. With new abundance of material goods, new scarcities of space and of desire emerged, and the, quote, center of interest, end quote, had been displaced from work toward leisure and the family. New groups bearing new forms of alienation had emerged: white-collar workers, women, young people, who might become part of a new radical force, that they did not constitute social classes. Capitalism had attempted to, quote, integrate the classical working class and had partially succeeded. In 1967, Lefebvre stated flatly that the working class no longer had revolutionary aims, yet the proletariat had not vanished as the liberals claimed. On the contrary, its condition of powerlessness had been generalized and regrouped into a new working class. If one adds to these social changes imperialism and the world wars, one has blended a new social reality, the age of modernity. Lefebvre, still considering himself a Marxist, was no longer certain of the cliches of the past, no longer, quote, convinced about an absolute end to alienation, end quote. The new world of modernity was not for him a unified social formation, but a transitional period toward eventual revolution. Only in 1968 did he have a clear enough sense of this society to give it a name: the, quote, bureaucratic society of controlled consumption, end quote, Lefebvre. However organized this society pretended to be, it lacked a unifying direction, a true integration, a style. The emergence of daily life went hand in hand with the disintegration of style, the aesthetic unification of the most trivial acts into a meaningful cultural whole. Even the working class of the 19th century, with its burden of toil and poverty, retained a style. Modern daily life stood between boredom and the rebirth of style into a festival, a gathering together of, quote, culture's scattered fragments for a transfiguration of everyday life, end quote. Returning to his infatuation with surrealism in the 1920s, Lefebvre took his concept of style from L'Internationale lettriste. Check out the piece. I have a piece on the lettriste. It's not neutral at all, but by Anselm Joppa in his biography of Guy Debord, and obviously there's a relationship between the Situationist and Lefebvre. Anyway, returning to his infatuation with surrealism in the 1920s, Lefebvre took his concept of style from the Internationale lettriste, a more recent form of anti-conformist romanticism interested in iconoclastic posturing, not in politics. Since the turn of the century, there had occurred a, quote, chute des référentiels, a collapse of old social and intellectual reference points without any replacement. Groping hesitantly for a concept that would distinguish the strange new world of 1960 from the past, Lefebvre pointed to the lack of social coherence in modernity. Older societies engaged everyone in a common culture, with modernity privatized the masses. While modernity privatized the masses. Hence the unique contradiction of modernity. On the one hand, the progress of technology led to the organized socialization of all experiences. On the other, a new type of existence, daily life, emerged and stagnated outside the general movement of history. People were at once organized into activities that were complex and controlled, yet in these activities they were totally unaware of themselves as social public beings. 3. Daily life revisited. In the second volume of the Critique, 1961, Lefebvre broke from Marx's tutelage and elaborated the idea. Sorry, did I say it was new heading 3. Daily life revisited. I don't know if there's a subheading, I'm getting lost. In the second volume of the Critique, Lefebvre broke from Marx's tutelage and elaborated the idea of daily life beyond the general bounds of the concept of alienation. Although the second volume was a proliferation of categories that approached incoherence, a working definition of daily life was presented along the main themes and methods of empirical research. Negatively, daily life was non-work experience, life outside the means of production. In the Marxist framework, daily life was situated at the frontiers between the base and the superstructure, considerably revising the central distinction of historical materialism. The reign of daily life was placed at a blind spot of old Marxism where praxis did not apply. It was the, quote, region of the approbation by man, of his own nature, end quote, or poesis. Abandoning the Marxist image of society as structures resting on a base, Lefebvre termed daily life a, quote, level, suggesting a polyvalent image with each level having its own significance. The level of daily life was now more prominent than the place of production because it was there that the, quote, human was, quote, discovered and, quote, created. In the 20th century, daily life was penetrated by technical objects to an unprecedented degree, but it was also the point of the negation of capitalism. The privatized realm of daily life, where the masses made their most fateful choices, was essentially free, autonomous, ungoverned, and uncontrolled, regardless of the efforts of bureaucratic capitalism. Lefebvre's daily life replaced Marx's workplace as the vulnerable heart of society, the point where human will could choose revolution, where new types of alienation were most oppressive and blatant. With daily life as the organizing concept, Lefebvre could discover historical tensions that were not named by previous Marxists. Daily life was characterized by boredom and passivity, wherein the masses viewed their society as a, quote, spectacle. What maintained the precarious balance between the masses' passivity and their dutiful, punctual, if apathetic performance of their functions was the role of new commodities and the mass media in their lives. The automobile privatized life. The TV, radio, and newspapers pacified it. The new commodities, different from the fetishes described by Marx, who thought of them primarily within their circulation, from production to sale, articulated a whole structure of meaning that intensified alienation. Confronting the world of consumerism, Marcuse and the Frankfurt School had turned to psychoanalysis to grasp the libidinal quality of commodities as substitute gratifications of eros. Lefebvre looked instead to their linguistic significance. What characterized daily life in modernity was the increasing predominance of signals over signs and images over symbols. The basic social interaction in daily life was that between the isolated consumer and the isolated object of consumption. Consumer commodities were essentially signals whose meaning was self-contained. The semiotic field of daily life reduced the consumer to reflexes, automatic responses, i.e. to passivity. The traffic signal, with its simple but inexorable code was the paradigm of communication in daily life. Stop, go, commands without any space for interrogation, much less refusal. Like gadgets whose functions are built into their structure, offering no options to the operator, messages in the mass media are organized to wipe out the receiver's independence and judgment. Advertisements promise self-realization through consumption, like an aftershave advertisement showing a vibrant youth on a sailboat with the caption, quote, "A real man's life is marvelous. It's truly marvelous to find every morning the tonic freshness of your aftershave," end quote. There's a footnote that I missed here. Footnote. There are obvious similarities between Marcuse's one-dimensional society and Lefebvre's daily life. Also, there are similar roles as theorists of the New Left. Lefebvre acknowledged the affinity, but criticized Marcuse for finding no negation parallel to his own concept of daily life. Marcuse's role, by the way, in the development of existential Marxism in France was notable. The first full study of Marcuse's thought in French appeared only after the upheaval of May 1968 by J.M. Falmier. And the first journal to devote an entire issue to Marcuse did not come out until 1969, and was able to entitle its issue Marcuse c'est inconnu. January-March 1969, with articles by Lefebvre, Goldmann, and others. Nevertheless, it was the existential Marxists of the Argument group who pioneered the reading of Marcuse in France with their translation of Eros and Civilization, One-Dimensional Man, and an essay on liberation, all of which appeared in the collection Argument. The Argument group was interested in another leader of the Frankfurt School, Theodor Adorno, who was translated into the journal in 1959. Nevertheless, extensive translating of Frankfurt School works did not come until the 1970s. A systematic comparison of the two groups is beyond the scope of this study. Nevertheless, the following three themes would be central: the Frankfurt School's conception of critical theory and the concept of planetary thought of the Argument group, each group's treatment of superstructural elements such as art, communication, and so forth. Finally, a comparison between Marcuse's concept of one-dimensional society and Lefebvre's concept of everyday life. End footnote. This is in reference to the aftershave advertisement I was just talking about. This advertisement was a signal image unifying signifiers: the beautiful man, the boat, aftershave, with signified self-realization that could be gobbled up in one act of consumption. Then, too, there was the negative threat of the advertisement. It's, quote, terrorism. Quote, use this aftershave or you will be nobody and know it, end quote. An incredible reversal occurs in which the object is active and the subject is passive in the interaction. With signs, the subject had some degree of freedom to connect the signifier to the signified in a synthetic appropriation of meaning. When symbols structured communication, there was still more meaning because the symbol had a value in itself, not merely referring to the signified object. Signals offered none of these advantages. Moreover, in daily life, signals were communicated in isolation, detotalizing the semantic experience. In daily life, Lefebvre asserted, the masses endured a tension between two types of time. In peasant society, cyclical time associated with nature was culturally dominant. In industrial societies generated a new cumulative time, linear and progressive, based on mechanical objects that lost the previous rhythmic quality. Although cumulative time penetrated everywhere, daily life still required the time of reproduction of life, the continuous effort of its recreation. Here was the spot where revolutionary action could always interrupt the routine. Quote, everyday life is ... the time of desire, end quote, of spontaneous renewal. Lefebvre's discussion of temporality in daily life resembled that of Georges Friedman, an independent Marxist sociologist of work who distinguished between a, quote, milieu naturel, end quote, of pre-machine societies and a, quote, milieu technique, end quote, in which rhythms, time, sensibilities, and values were all dominated by machines. Friedman's categories were too static and too objectified for Lefebvre, though they were both concerned with the organization of work and modernity. Friedman's answer to his own question, où va le travail humain, I don't know if I'm saying that right, was like Lefebvre's, quote, a disparate, I have no idea, unquote. From visits to America, Friedman also found the workers' quote, center of gravity, and quote, was displaced from work to non-work, end quote. Although his nostalgia for craftsmanship prevented him from envisioning the same radical possibilities as Lefebvre for a society beyond work, a post-industrial festival of daily life. In the second article of the articulation of the concept of daily life, Lefebvre began to outline the central categories of a new Marxist sociology. New heading 4, Language in Daily Life. Two books in the mid-1960s, Le Langage et la Société of 1966 and Position contre les technocrates of 1967, developed the theory of signals from the 1961 critique. Now Lefebvre sought to incorporate information theory, linguistics, cybernetics, game theory, and structuralism while exposing their ideological aspects. In these recent trends, language is a new principle of intelligibility, discarding older concepts of substance and subject. Lefebvre rejected the reductionism of the structuralists, their flight from history, their refusal to see language in the context of social action. The linguist and structuralist, as he saw them, posed as neutral scientists who refused to set criteria of good and bad communication. Hence Lefebvre called them technocrats. Like all other human phenomena, language for Lefebvre was a work of poesis, a creation and appropriation of meaning by man in a historico-social situation. Language was an essential expression of the subject. Agreeing with Heidegger that language is either authentic or inauthentic, he set the spoken word, la parole, as the ideal of expression between equal men in a totally democratic situation. From this standard, he looked at the evolution of communication to locate the structures that mutilated the ideal. La Belle Époque witnessed the already mentioned, quote, chute des référentiels, quote, the core of absolute meanings dissolved. Newtonian absolute time and space and perspective line in painting all vanished. Relations of production became hidden. Ideas were, quote, desubstantialized. Since then, the increasing disengagement of language from, quote, the practical, sensible, referential, end quote, drove communication toward nonsense and the absurd. This process began mildly during the Renaissance with the birth of a commodity economy. The commodity was, for Lefebvre, as for Marx, a form of exchange and communication though a particularly poor form because, with the mechanism of price and money, commodities detached both their, quote, content, the labor that went into them, and their, quote, signified, the need they were to fulfill, from the exchange interaction. The buyer and the seller saw only the price. Quote, the look plunges into the signifier, price, in a pure obsessive state, end quote. Marx's concept of the fetishism of commodities was thus translated by Lefebvre into linguistic terms. With the dominance of a commodity economy, quote, chains of signifiers, end quote, were disconnected from, quote, signifieds, end quote, yielding, quote, a strange form of unconsciousness, end quote, in society. In such a context, things had a self-contained existence. When sociology made abundance possible, it was easy for advertisers to invest commodities with images of satisfaction that did not reflect use value. Words were replaced by images with the spread of mass media. These images of sexual virility, popularity, etc. were in the form of signals, so that they pacified the consumers. In their cars and in front of their televisions, consumers were bombarded with mystifying information and deeply alienated social relations. The social world fragmented into a plethora of semiotic systems like the world of high fashion, as discussed by Barthes in the book Système de la Mode, with no cross-references or unification. Integrated by the state and by corporate bureaucracies, everyday life at the same time completely fragmented. The outcome was paradoxical, quote, loneliness in the midst of overcrowding, lack of communication, and a proliferation of signs and information, end quote. Daily life was a linguistic, quote, 0 point, where isolated, disconnected signs made their appearance, having only a displaced unity at the distant point of their invention. The invention of the institution of writing, écriture, further detached communication from the personal, direct expression of la parole. Writing was a form of, quote, violence, terrorism, and domination, end quote, a one-way form of communication that enabled the ruling class to mystify its power through propaganda. Lefebvre's reference for la parole over l'écriture, however, was riddled with difficulties. To a critic of Lefebvre's position, like Derrida, for example, the celebration of la parole required a false identity of meaning and sign, and ultimately an impossible metaphysics in which the absolute, quote, presence of both was asserted. The utopia of la parole suppressed the absence, the gap, la brisure, between sign and meaning. To Derrida, la parole was itself a form of l'écriture because it connected meaning and sign only through a system of differences and articulated language. The chances for miscommunication were no greater in written than in oral languages. For Lefebvre, the signal, the commodity, the image, and writing all worked their deteriorating effects on communication in the context of the chute des référentiels, in which society had no common horizon of meaning. No wonder that the working class had lost its sense of historical direction. Lefebvre could now illuminate the demise of the proletariat in light of a consumer society with organized domination through language. Quote, what happened? How can one expropriate the working class, steal its objectives from it, its goals, its meaning? A gigantic substitution has taken place. For work and for the worker as subject, individual and collective, the consumer has been substituted, who is no longer a subject but a place, that of consumption. Who speaks? The one who teaches consumption, the advertiser, the organizer of the everyday, the one who initiates the coincidence of the image and the situation, between the ideal and the real. To whom does one speak? To the consumer, to his ideal. When one speaks, quote, to me, it is not to me but to the possible consumer, the ideal. To what end? To consolidate a society still poorly defined, in danger, in question, where the ruling classes seek to reinforce the integrative capacity that they had under competitive capitalism, end quote. Lefebvre. The contradiction in daily life centered in its function of reproducing social equilibrium. With competitive capitalism, the market mechanism worked well enough, even with its crises, to maintain social stability with the workers not in the society but of the society. The market collapsed in the 1930s, never regaining its autonomy. Bourgeois democracy receded to fascism and voter apathy. The worldview of liberalism lost its coherence and order. Faced with this crisis, advertising and propaganda entered daily life, encroached upon the intimacy of family life and leisure, in order to effect artificially a commitment from the individual to consume, while at the same time maintaining political and spiritual confusion. With daily life organized through the restructuring of language, the liberal notion of the independent individual, of the rational self-interested utilitarian ego, inevitably became obsolete. The role of structuralism in the process was clear to Lefebvre. Its basic proclamation of the end of man, the denial of the human subject, was no more than an ideological legitimization of the newest form of alienation. The quote, anti-humanism of Foucault, Lévi-Strauss, and Althusser reflected the new situation in which the working class no longer saw its historical mission, and the bourgeois ego was no longer integrated, autonomous, and self-conscious. When structuralists announced that kinship systems, languages, and epistemologies were structures without subjects, they did not look for the alienation of the subject, his loss of control through direct or indirect class conflict, but simply proclaimed the givenness of their finding. Lefebvre granted that the unconsciousness of history, the absence of a subject, made a philosophical anthropology very difficult. To move from these facts to the theoretical demonstration of the necessity of the subject's absence, as structuralists did, was an ideological mystification par excellence, even if this result was not intended by them. Lefebvre attempted to reformulate a socio-historical theory of the subject without ontologizing it, one of the main concerns of existential Marxism. Quote, "It is not necessary to sacrifice the, quote, subject. From philosophy, we detach the concept of the subject in order to transform it. It doubles. On one side, we have social subjects, groups, and classes. On the other, we have sociological agents, capable of elaborating and putting into action economic, political, and military strategies. Society cannot be defined as a subject, but as an ensemble of social subjects, not without lacunae, and a network of sociological agents, not without lapses," end quote. Lefebvre. This double determination of social subjects and sociological agents was nothing but Merleau-Ponty's concept of ambiguity and Sartre's individual as both subject and object, albeit transferred from ontological to social terms. Heading 5. The Festival of Daily Life. La vie quotidienne dans le monde moderne of 1968, the book, summarized and integrated the studies of the 1960s, formulating a program of action. Slogans were invented, quote, "technology in the service of daily life," end quote, and, quote, "automation on the economic level, the abolition of the state and self-administration on the political level," quote, "let daily life become a work of art," end quote, "sexual and urban reform," and, quote, "the festival rediscovered," end quote, "on the cultural plane." Daily life would include the tone of desire, from Mascolo, la parole, from linguistics, satisfaction, from Châtelet, poesis, from Heidegger, play, from Sartre and Axelos, all suggesting the vision of Charles Fourier. This utopianism was not another eschatology to Lefebvre, since the projected, quote, "new life" was based on existing technical capacities, a careful dialectical and sociological analysis of the alienations of daily life, and a program for change. There was to be a, quote, "democratic regrouping," end quote, "of the left, not another, quote, "government of the left," end quote, that would, quote, "only strengthen the state," end quote, rather a, quote, "destructuring period," end quote, that aimed at, quote, "decentralization," end quote, allowing, quote, "new social forces to develop," end quote. Were it not for the events of May 1968, one might be tempted to conclude that Lefebvre was a visionary romantic. The festival of daily life hinged on the fate of, quote, "urbanism." In his theory of industrialization, Marx had not seen that the process of urbanization was not reducible to the economy. In fact, the urban environment contained the most profound potentials of modernity. In the city, quote, "creation of creations," end quote, everyday life would become a creation, poesis, not praxis, of which each citizen and each community would be capable, end quote. The negative model of society, the spectacle of daily life, was the new city Mourenx, I guess that's how you say it, Mourenx, where the alienations of daily life congealed in a singular sterility. Where the hell am I? Urbanism, on the other hand, concretized the program of the festival into the poesis of creating new situations from desire. Morin was planned to be totally functional, eliminating from the environment places of spontaneous encounter that were the hallmark of older cities. Hence, Morin suffered from the nemesis of daily life, boredom, diverse social phenomena such as promiscuity and the presence of children, which in some settings made for rich experience, in Morin only inhibited sociability. Yet Morin also demonstrated the power of daily life as the place of self-creation. Morin was inhabited by the new working class who showed, quote, a remarkable and profound aspiration for democracy in urban life, for the self-managed activity of the collectivity, for a socialization directed against statism and centralized bureaucracy, including concrete liberties, end quote. Subject to the most advanced automation of the workplace, the new working class no longer worked collectively, no longer operated with tools, no longer handled raw materials directly. Its work was the, quote, non-work of the control and surveillance of machines. The new workers did not repeat the, quote, passivity, indifference, and corruption, end quote, of the old syndicalist, quote, worker aristocracy, end quote. Instead, they shifted the center of their concern to the city, to daily life, where they struggle with the self-consciousness of an emergent social class, actively to control their environment and their lives, to have life become a festival of spontaneous free encounters. Nothing less than the fate of modernity was at stake in the struggle of the new working class to define itself as a self-determining class. A new urbanism was already in the process of birth. Prophetically, 1 year before the explosion of May, Lefebvre asserted that the terrorism and over-repression of daily life could not long be sustained. Lefebvre's vision of the festival resonated loudly among young radicals like Guy Debord in the Society of the Spectacle and Raoul Vaneigem in Traité des Savoir Vivre à la usage des jeunes générations, both of the Internationale Situationniste, which began in 1958. Their strategy of interrupting the routines of daily life with guerrilla theater in order to, quote, create situations was traceable to Lefebvre, although they asserted that he took too much from them. Although they asserted that he also took much from them. Another left group influenced by him was Noir et Rouge, 1956, that was established in 1956, with its theory of workers' councils as the model revolutionary organization. I'd like to know more about that organization, that journal or group, Noir et Rouge, because it seemed like a place that had like a lot of like really sick people like working on it from like across the libertarian left spectrum. Noir et Rouge obviously meaning red and black. In addition, a student journal from the École Normale Supérieure of Saint-Cloud, Aletheia, of 1964 to 1967 reflected Lefebvre's theme of the need for a cultural revolution. It published Heidegger and Marcuse in translation as well as Axelos and Châtelet. Lefebvre's Existential Marxism was thus a direct stimulus to a new radicalism that was geared to advance capitalist society. New heading: Lefebvre and Sartre. Lefebvre's metaphilosophy of daily life was dependent upon Sartre's thought. The parallels between the two were striking. Metaphysically, metaphilosophy was explicitly a synthesis of Marxism and alien existentialism. If we adopt the Hegelian and Marxist trend, that is, the realization of the rational through philosophy, a critical theory of everyday life ensues. If we adopt the Nietzschean theory of values, a constructive theory of everyday life emerges. This is the first step, end quote. Let us not forget that in the book Being and Nothingness, Sartre initiated a philosophy of everyday life, locating it exactly as did Lefebvre as the place of recreation. In the 1960s, Lefebvre time and again turned to Sartre to agree or to modify his positions, elevating him as the major figure in contemporary philosophy. Lefebvre now incorporated many aspects of the book Being and Nothingness and the book Critique of Dialectical Reason directly. Sartre was the first to mount a serious criticism of Stalinist philosophy. He, quote, pulled no punches, end quote, by stating, quote, what too many people thought and said only too quietly, end quote. Lefebvre, what is more, Sartre's master, Husserl, was the first to notice and adopt as a problem the crisis of philosophy in technological society. Changing his opinion from the 1940s, Lefebvre even agreed with Sartre that Engels' notion of an objective dialectic of nature was wrong, which is something that is was also done by Lukacs in 1923. His borrowings from Sartre were considerable. From the critique, the idea that there was two kinds of thought, analytical and dialectical, and the dramatization of the concept of totality into totalizations and totalizing activities of the subject. From the book Being and Nothingness, the concepts of engagement, the situation, revolution as a, quote, choice of oneself, end quote, the appropriation of, quote, possibility through a, quote, project, inauthenticity as a critical concept, and a concept of, quote, creative freedom, end quote. Lefebvre's reservations about existentialism were no longer those of the 1940s when Sartre was dismissed as an idealist. Now Sartre made errors that could be corrected without destroying his overall thought. Sartre's errors were that he did not pose the question of the realization of philosophy. His thought was still ontological and speculative. His concept of action was only a, quote, doing that omitted the work or object. He had still not, quote, recovered the historical, end quote, and his idea of freedom stemmed, quote, too much from consciousness, end quote. These weaknesses of Sartre's existential Marxism did not deter Lefebvre from using it in his own work. In a study of the bourgeoisie, he applied Sartre's existential phenomenology to a social class which with such affinity to being and nothingness that it could have been appended to Sartre's book. The bourgeois created his belonging only through merit, leaving in permanent question a split between his mere appearance as a bourgeois and his being a bourgeois in essence, the way an aristocrat was always an aristocrat. The fissure between being and having evoked the problem of morality for the bourgeois and led him to his original project of trying to be distinctive. Quote, with the analysis of the distinction, we reach the quintessence of bourgeois consciousness. The bourgeois distinguishes, he sees far and clear, he calculates, he reckons, he reasons, he isolates, he divides work, individuals, groups, activities, and realities. He dichotomizes, atomizes in all domains. Bourgeois thought always functions in the mode of distinction and separation. It is analytical understanding. At the same time, the bourgeois wishes to be distinguished. The concept of distinction denotes bourgeois subjectivity and the objective activity of the bourgeois. It is a way of being, end quote. Lefebvre. This analysis was supplemented by a historical study of the various efforts of the bourgeois in different epochs. There's a footnote that I missed. It says, in fact, Lefebvre's phenomenological study of the bourgeoisie was no more than an amplification of Sartre's treatment of it in his Critique of Dialectical Reason. End footnote. Thus, Lefebvre exemplified a social and historical usage of Sartre's existentialism. Like Sartre, Lefebvre read the present as a technological world, an automated world where the question of producing things, of conquering nature, in short, of working, was replaced by the work of self-creation. The prime question concerned the superstructure. Would the new working class recognize in itself the problem of the realization of philosophy? Would it see its problem as one of authentic self-creation in the context of collective action and in the situation of urbanism? Basically, what separated the two existential Marxists was their personal moral visions. Lefebvre was always the optimist, anticipating utopian possibilities. Sartre remained the eternal stoic, resisting the temptations of hope, refusing to sketch the lines of the future, preferring to capture the self-deceptions and illusions of the present. Lefebvre and Sartre, each in his own way, were prophets of May 1968, yet it must be noted that Lefebvre and the Argument group in general were not generous towards Sartre, and the two major forms of existential Marxism remained isolated from each other. New section, section 8, the question of Freud, or new heading 8. The enormous impact of Freud's thought on the 20th century eventually forced the French to give up their resistance to him. Henri Lefebvre was probably the first French philosopher to read Freud seriously, but he did so only during his brief interest in surrealism in the 1920s. By the 1960s, it had been demonstrated clearly enough that Freud's thought was rich, with potentials for explaining aspects of ideology, like the stubborn endurance of traditions and the tendency for lower classes to defer willingly to ruling classes, which were beyond the scope of Marxist theory. As theory and as practice, Freudianism posed a challenge to all doctrines, but especially to Marxism. The apparent meaning of Freudian psychology undercut the argument for social revolution, deflecting energies into individual readjustment. A few heretics in the Marxist camp, like Wilhelm Reich and later Herbert Marcuse, denied the conservative image of Freud, making Freud a cultural revolutionary who advocated the end of sexual repression and the authoritarian bourgeois family. In France, the Argument group was among the first Marxists to answer the Freudian challenge. Argument translated Marcuse's treatise on Freudo-Marxism and published Georges Lapassade's L'entrée dans la vie and Joseph Goebbels' La fausse conscience, essai sur la réification. Hence it was the arguments group that initiated the turn to the question of desire in social thought, the issue of a radical concept of libidinal economy that has been enormously popular in France since the mid-1960s. The other main line of French Freudian interpretation, that of Jacques Lacan, who was unknown in Marxist circles until the mid-1960s, will be treated later in the chapter on structuralism. I've chosen to discuss the study of Joseph Goebbels rather than Lapassade because he best exemplifies a synthesis of psychological conceptions with the question of the dialectic. Goebbels, who studied with Minkowski and Mannheim, reconciled Marxism and psychology by testing the parallels between the concept of reification developed by Lukacs and Goldmann and the psychological category of schizophrenia. The Marxist concepts of dialectic and alienation were the categories that encompassed psychological reality. The modes of alienation within the superstructure that Marx articulated, ideology, false consciousness, reification, fetishism, were analogous to the mental distortions revealed by psychologists. The common denominator rested with the anti-dialectical nature of both pathologies. Drawing upon an enormous mass of psychological documentation, Goebbels argued that reification and schizophrenia diverged from the dialectic in the same way. False consciousness displayed the traits of schizophrenia, and schizophrenia, especially in Minkowski's definition, resembled reification. The dialectic was seen as the basis of an axiology, a theory of the structure of values, demarcating the authentic and the inauthentic experience of values. Alienating modes of thought, all presented values spatially, devitalizing them, denying their temporal qualities, their openness to the future. Studies of schizophrenic patients revealed the same spatial qualities in their thought. Melancholics, hysterics, psychotics, all the major types of abnormality, demonstrated the same derealization or detemporalization of experience. It is important that our concern with existential Marxism to note that Goebbels regarded the existential psychologies of Binswanger, a Heideggerian, and Sartre as particularly close to Marxism. In fact, he stated that existentialism was not a, quote, romantic rebellion against reason, end quote, but a, quote, dialectical reaction against depersonalization, end quote, in contemporary society. Sartre's existentialism, stressing the temporal quality of consciousness, was fully dialectical and completely assimilable by Marxism. Quote, the thought of the existentialist school represents ... a reaction against schizophrenization, anti-dialectic, in collective consciousness and false consciousness. End quote. Goebbels. Goebbels' conclusion matched the concern of the Argument group for a Marxist theory of the superstructure. Quote, the concept of morbid rationalism. Morbid rationalism shows the preponderance of the spatializing, reifying aspect of the seizure of the real, to the determinant of its temporalizing historical aspect, and is the common denominator of the various forms of economic and political alienation. Moreover, the expression par excellence of non-dialectical consciousness, reified and unaxiological, morbid rationalism appears as the schizophrenic type. Gabel. Hacking our way through Gabel's jargon, we see that his examination of the intersections between Marxism and psychology demonstrated the value of separate studies of the superstructure to illuminate its dynamics. Since, quote, reification of consciousness was possible outside of the context of capitalism, and, quote, cultural change was, in part, independent of economic change. The Argument group developed an existential Marxism by reworking the advances of the 1940s. Hegel's dialectic of consciousness was preserved and transcended. Aufgehoben in Axelos's planetary thought, Lefebvre's metaphilosophy, Fouché-Roulas's dialectic of contradiction and totality, Chatelet's empirical satisfaction. Marx's concept of alienated labor was placed in an open totality, with new modes of alienation uncovered, the autonomy of the superstructure maintained, and a concession that some alienation was irreducible. Sartre's concept of freedom became social and historical with the concept of self-creation in an urban situation. In sum, the theory of the Argument group contained a self-imposed incompleteness, demanding that thought be kept open so that it could be related to practice. Their theories preserved the necessary incompleteness of Marxist thought, refusing to become a closed rational system. The ultimate verification of the thought of the Argument group lay with the action of people who would or would not demonstrate its anthropology in fact. The Argument group had brought existential Marxism into being as a critical social theory that defined the needs of thought through the needs of human emancipation, that connected truth to being through the mediation of social transformation. Okay, and that is the end of chapter 6 of Existential Marxism in France by Mark Poster. Chapter 6 was titled The Argument Group, Existentialized Marxists. Chapter 7 is titled Come on. Come on, you little bastard. Existentialism and structure. Nope. Fuck, I skipped too far. It's titled Sartre's Critique. Oh, come on. Sartre's Critique, Marxian Existentialism. Thank you so much for listening.